Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Perspective. Tonight on Perspective, we examine two major developments shaping regional and global stability, from growing tensions in South Asia to renewed efforts for peace in the Middle East. First, we look at the escalating dispute over India's Chenab hydroelectric projects and the future of the Indus Water Treaty. Pakistan has raised concerns over India's approach towards shared water resources, arguing that unilateral actions risk undermining decades of water diplomacy and increasing mistrust between the two nuclear-armed neighbors. The debate now centers on whether water is becoming a new instrument of strategic pressure and whether dialogue can prevent further escalation. Then we turn to the US-Iran situation, where despite renewed military tensions, diplomatic channels remain open and regional efforts continue to deserve a fragile peace process. With a focus now on restraint, communication and mediation, the key question is whether both sides can now move away from confrontation and sustain a path towards stability. These are the issues shaping today's geopolitical landscape, and we bring you the analysis tonight on Perspective. I have with me Dr. Roxolana Zigón, who is Director of the Scientific Center for International and Strategic Research in Moscow, joining us on this very, very important issue. Of course, as far as the Indus Water Treaty is concerned, Pakistan's narrative surrounding this is concerned, and the way that we have consistently advocated for this not to be used as a weapon of terrorism that we see coming from across the border. Roxolana, is India, in your opinion, turning water into that weapon? You know, like as I was earlier saying, by using Chenab hydro projects as a tool of political and strategic pressure against Pakistan. What are your thoughts on this?
Thank you very much for your question. First of all, I would like to mention that the geopolitical landscape currently is overheated by the fragility and mistrust. And this landscape is creating a new pretext for the serious geopolitical tension and conflict, where water treaty, Indus Water Treaty, becomes an important issue, a dispute issue between two nuclear powers, two nuclear states, India and Pakistan. Unfortunately, since 2025, since April 2025, and the Pahalgam attack that has been strongly used by Indian side as a pretext, as a predicament of attacking Pakistan and encircling Pakistan with a new so-called anti-diplomatic manner or anti-diplomatic agenda, trying to provoke Pakistan for new conflict escalation. These kind of attacks we have been witnessing and seeing for the last year quite actively, and the momentum, the historical momentum that was chosen by India in order to break up the oldest treaty, water treaty that existed for decades, almost for 66 years. Even it survived during the whole setup of wars between India and Pakistan. So India chose this moment not accidentally. Due to the tremendous and unprecedented success of Pakistan in diplomatic domain in relation to the US-Iran peace settlement, India started to lose its diplomatic authority and diplomatic influence, and we could see it in Indian media how hysterical they have been reacting on that. Therefore, the Pahalgam attack and also successful breakthrough of Pakistan in Switzerland when the peace deal has been signed used it as an opportunity to actually open a new provocation. So they started to speed up the construction of hydroelectric stations on Chenab River, which actually belongs to western side of rivers, belongs to Pakistan, in order to expand the agenda of that conflict. Absolutely no doubt about that India is strongly weaponizing the issue and trying not only to provocate Pakistan, but to create a predicament and pretext for a serious war conflict.
Roxolana, like you said, India's position as far as this issue is concerned, Pakistan has taken this up on multiple forums in terms of the efficacy of international law and what we've been able to achieve, sadly, you also realize, and the world has also seen. Do you expect there to be some sort of a reaction? Can Pakistan legitimately expect the world to sort of take a stance? Because even as we speak, this is a precedent in the making. And of course, this is, like I said, and you've also mentioned, using water this way, the way that it's happening and the fact that these are two nuclear states. In that sense, do you see that resonating with the world?
I think it should resonate, definitely. I'm afraid that the level of this resonation should change. And Pakistan is doing a completely correct, in a completely correct manner. Pakistan is addressing this issue on a new level, trying to demonstrate what kind of perspectiveness can take place for the whole world, not only for the region of South Asia or Middle East, but giving a broader perspective to the global community in order to reassess the geopolitical landscape, geoeconomic landscape, and also what is really important, and that has been not mentioned in the global media as well, is geopolitically and geocognitive context. It means that in the actually break of the new global order, and when we see that the world is turning into a multipolar system, one of the most important issues is not a power provocation, but an issue of the expanding influence, expanding a narrative. So Pakistan is winning on that side. I mean, in a diplomatic narrative and trying to address that issue in this Waters Treaty on a new level. So I think that the global community will definitely be resonating. But there is another problem, is that for the last decades, the international legal system has been deteriorated, along with the international relations system. So therefore, there is a momentum when Pakistan can come up and also address this issue in relation to the problem issue of Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir. I think these two questions are strongly interconnected. And there is actually an evident predicament to address these two issues. Of course, the first one is Indus Waters Treaty, but later on, the issue of Jammu and Kashmir will come definitely in place. As soon as we hear quite often that the Indian side, Indian authorities, are using quite negative, provocative rhetoric, saying that water and blood are not drifting together and that we will block Pakistan unless Pakistan will not remove all its terroristic settlements. So it means that there is no way for diplomatic dialogue from the Indian side. In this context, Pakistan should actually continue its efforts promoting the diplomatic agenda.
When you talk about, of course, the fact that we see this confrontational, but do you think that India is moving away, of course, towards even the pretext of dialogue, towards clear confrontation? It doesn't seem to be concerned with Pakistan's growing narrative at this time, our growing outreach diplomatically. That's a facade. Do you think that India is, of course, like the world, cognizant of the kind of image that it is now sending out into the world? The facade that it seems is crumbling as far as India as a nation, of course, and what they've been selling to the world in terms of wanting peace in the region doesn't seem to be standing, and particularly with regard to this water context now.
The world is really complex now, and it's not even the point what you're selling to the world. The point is what the world is ready to buy. Therefore, I think that India is seriously losing trust. And this situation actually, its attempts to escalate the conflict between India and Pakistan will actually be not turned in favor of India. That's why I think that Pakistan starting this dialogue, these diplomatic efforts, should give a growth to that kind of process and to establish perhaps an Islamabad Accords or Global Islamabad Waters Treaty Forum, find a much broader global framework. And we have seen that Islamabad peace talks actually already has given a pretext for that kind of diplomatic framework. So Pakistan is not selling, Pakistan is not trying to sell a kind of agenda or to turn the global audience in its favor. Pakistan is trying to place on the table very strong and clear arguments and statements in order to demonstrate in a comparative analysis and a very straight comparative analysis how the situation is developing and what kind of effect and consequences may take place for the global security and as well for the regional security, for the whole architecture in the South Asia, where Pakistan is playing an increasing role.
When we look at, Roxana, you also mentioned this, that the world, it seems at this time, is not overly concerned with international law, even abuse of international law, if we look at the recent past and what's happening around us. Do you think that, in the absence of efficacy of international law, in the absence of the world holding those that violate these treaties, that violate the law at this time, very, very clearly, as we see India doing, what other alternatives are there for nations like peace-loving nations like Pakistan? That of course, like as I was mentioning earlier, want to tell their real, true story to the world and want there to be some kind of a deterrent to this kind of terrorism that keeps coming from states like India.
I actually draw another vision, a scenario of development of these things. We should remember that the third party that actually participated in settling the dispute between India and Pakistan after its separation, partition in 1947. And we remember that process was really rocky. It took some time, quite a long time, before the agreement has been signed, since 1947 until 1960. And we remember that the third party was actually represented by the Western entity, by the World Bank. And unfortunately, we cannot register an active participation. We cannot rely nowadays on the Western legal camp, let's say. We know that Pakistan has been strongly trying to upbring that issue to the United Nations, to all the whole diversity of legal structures in the West. But unfortunately, even considering that the team of independent experts have been constantly involved, so we have registered a plenty of manipulations with these issues. So my vision depicts another scenario. I think that Pakistan should actually address this issue in the context of Shanghai Cooperation Agreement organization, for example. So to move that problem, that dispute, on a new kind of level or a new platform, and to address that from the position of the peace-loving countries. And we both know that India and Pakistan are both full members of the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement. So where Russia, China, India, Pakistan, and other countries can equally participate, we also remember that India has been doing whatever it takes to prevent Pakistan to join BRICS. These two platforms, these two formats are very important in constructing a new multipolar reality. I think that the scenario that I actually described now can be a proper way in order to address this problem on a new level in the future.
When we look at India, there's little doubt that New Delhi is using its position as an upper riparian to exert pressure on a lower riparian like Pakistan. Are there specific provisions, and I believe that there are in the treaty, that address this issue? And you think that this kind of violation in terms of the UN, in terms of the UN Security Council, do you think that we can legitimately expect a reaction?
I think India will do whatever it takes, especially in the pretext waiting for the visit of the American president to India, because they want a full revenge and compensation for all those political, geopolitical, and diplomatic losses that they experience. So they want definitely to work hard on eliminating or annihilating the effect that Pakistan has reached by being a peace moderator between Iran and the United States. So also India is a member of the Security Council of United Nations, and definitely they have the whole package of diplomatic and legal instruments in order to manipulate or fabricate their own understanding of this issue. From their point of view, they're not breaking any laws, so they're not breaking any legal framework, and they continue to block Pakistan in order to continue selling an agenda to the international orders that Pakistan continues to be, in their eyes, in their view, as a hub of terrorism. That's why they're actually abusing that rhetoric that they will not return back to diplomatic table until Pakistan will not stop provoking and promoting terroristic settlements. So that's why I think that India will continue the same mode of rhetoric and the same mode of addressing this issue. And
Roxolana, it doesn't seem like anything else except might is right. Correct me if I'm wrong, is really functioning at this time as far as the world is concerned. When we look at Pakistan's role, and you've mentioned it also, a number of times as far as the US-Iran war is concerned, what hopes does Pakistan have of having perhaps a country that has clout intervene and take this up on a national, international level? If, of course, like you're saying, that UN is Security Council, India has a seat on the table. And in terms of clout, of course, it's a larger economy. But in terms of Pakistan and its diplomatic outreach, what hopes do we have of having perhaps those countries that matter take a stand?
First of all, Pakistan should continue the work that it started in order to address to the international audience their own position, their own statements, stances, and arguments. This is really important. There should be a really let's say, strong media campaign launched by Pakistan and by partners of Pakistan, because Pakistan has gained a tremendous trust of its partners, China, Iran, the Gulf states, etc. So, and almost every country in the West, including Russia, has been expressing their appraisal and their gratitude for all the diplomatic efforts that have been made by Pakistan recently in relation to Iran and US. But we should not stop here. You have mentioned hopes and perspectives. I strongly believe that the time has come to reassess the very framework of the Indus Waters Treaty and to address this issue in connection to Jammu and Kashmir, very delicately, accurately, but step by step to
Right, thank you. Right, thank you so much, Roxolana. Thank you for joining us. Right, thank you for being with us. I'm going to move on to the second part of our program, which is, of course, US and Iran. And we have with us Binar F.K joining us, who's a research fellow in Middle East Security and Conflict Studies. Thank you for being with us. Binar, with tensions between the US and Iran rising again, what steps can both sides take immediately to sort of, prevent further military confrontation? Because, we know that strikes have continued. We also know the role that Israel continues to play and will continue to play as far as increasing the conflict and confrontation itself is concerned. Binar, please unmute. Please unmute.
Sorry about that. Thanks for having me. It's great to be with you. Well, it's a very critical moment right now, and this is absolutely certainly not a moment for military posturing. So both sides have already demonstrated capability. The both sides has demonstrated their uh, willingness, and the question is now to whether they can strike. The question is whether they can prevent this crisis from expanding. Military posturing may maybe satisfy the domestic audience in a short-term period, but in a long-term risks for the entire region, the Gulf, Iraq, Lebanon, and the whole Middle East, the global energy market can all be affected by US-Iran escalation. That's why dialogue is just the only diplomatic preference. It's just the only way that can save the regional stability. So both sides should prioritize continuing their talks, even if they disagree sharply. They need to keep the channel open, because cooperation does not necessarily mean friendship, but it means managing the rivalry that they have been having for the past time that we are witnessing.
We have also Michael Hilliard joining us, who's Director of Defense and Security Analysis at Oxus Society for Central Asian Affairs. Michael, thank you for being with us. Again, with the recent exchanges, if you heard what Binar has been saying, how important is it to maintain diplomatic channels open, considering what's happening at this time? And of course, would you agree that, of course, this situation remains fragile even as we speak? Between Iran and the US, and you know, of course, for this 60-day period and this MOU to morph into a full agreement, you know, how much of a diplomatic outreach would be needed? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, obviously diplomatic channels can be very important to keep going, particularly in an administration like this one, which is very personal. So that's why we're seeing a lot of outreach to third parties like Oman and other Gulf state nations to do intermediary work, as well as Pakistan, who's been a good negotiator for, and in between for both sides. I think the negotiations as they currently stand are pretty much where they have been for a while. Apart from the US position is weakening as time goes on, as fuel reserves draw down and infrastructure problems are coming down the pipeline. Iran, you know, the fact they put the Israel and Hezbollah ceasefire into the deal gives it an indication that they were not really certain that this would be this deal would be absolutely or the MOU would be absolutely concrete, and that's also reinforced by the fact that as soon as the MOU went in, about $40 billion worth of oil left the strait, mostly headed for China, with nothing coming back in. So I think the deal is pretty much where it has been for the last 2 months, but the US position is becoming more and more difficult as time goes on.
Binar, in terms of the continued military escalation or confrontation between the two states, what confidence building measures do you think both nations now need to take for this to actually work? And of course, it's a small time window compared to what we've seen in the past. So in that sense, time is not really on the side of this MOU.
Yeah, I think the first step should be a clear military to military deconflictation channel, even if it's indirect. Both sides need a way to quickly clarify what happened after an incident before responding militarily. Second, there should be a maritime security mechanism for the Strait of Hormuz, obviously, and nearby water channels that could include the shared notifications through mediators, agreed safe routes for commercial vessels, and commitment not to target civilian or commercial shipping. Third, both sides should avoid inflammatory public language. In a moment of crisis like this, rhetoric can become a policy, and if leaders use maximalist language, it becomes harder for negotiators to compromise. So in short, the goal should be to create enough space and enough structure so that one incident does not become a wider confrontation between both parties.
In terms of, Michael, what about the role of Israel? You know, it's extremely important, and we know that, you know, that is one factor that can't be ignored with regard to, of course, the Lebanon situation, with regard to the relationship of the US and Israel. More recently, we've also seen exchanges happen that indicate that the US, of course, has at least a rap on the knuckles, so to speak, as far as Israel is concerned. So how do you see that situation sort of developing? Do you see a stronger hand being exercised by the US at all? What is your perception of this?
Very much so. I mean, Israel has already been, the relationship has weakened between themselves and the United States, and Trump asking Israel to pull back from their positions in Lebanon is something that would be unthinkable even 6 to 8 months ago. But Israel is kind of the deal breaker in this scenario as things stand. Frankly, if Israel is occupying about 9% of Lebanon as they are now, it's almost inevitable that someone who's either been displaced or fighting for Hezbollah or just an angry teenager will fire upon the Israelis, and the Israelis will then have to fire back. So whilst Israel and Hezbollah are in this deal, either there has to be a major break in the US-Israel relationship, or the deal, that part of the deal has to be taken out, and it goes back to being a bilateral between the United States and Iran. So it is probably the most difficult part of this negotiation to get out of. And again, that's why I think Iran's left it in at this point in time. But more and more pressure is being mounted on Israel to back down.
Binar, when we look at what's happened between the US and Iran, of course, now there are direct channels of communication, I believe, open between US and Iran. But of course, there's a long history of mistrust here. Even then, we see that persisting. What is it going to take for that to sort of confidence building measures, or for that relationship? Of course, we also know the role that countries like Pakistan are playing. And so how do you see that sort of developing?
Yeah, I think the direct communication is quite important at this stage, but also it's not enough at its own. So communications only become useful when it's structured, when it's consistent, when it is connected to the decision makers from both stakeholders. So the first practical step is to create a direct, maybe emergency channel that can be activated immediately after any direct incident or confrontation, that would allow both sides to clarify the facts before acting on assumptions about each other. The second step is to define what counts as a violation from both sides. So if an agreement is vague, every incident become open to political interpretation or security interpretation. So both sides need to have a shared understanding of each other's red line, prohibited actions and responses and procedures. So finally, both sides need a gradual trust building mechanism. Trust will not come from speeches. It will come from small, verified, verified actions, like, for example, keeping the shipping lines open, avoiding attacks on each other, continuing the technical negotiations on the sideline, and respecting the agreed timeline. So the problem may not be right now the lack of communication, but as you also mentioned, it's a lack of principled and disciplined trust building that between both sides.
Michael, we also saw previously during an incident that happened, and then we saw a post by the US President clarifying what had happened. I'm sure you recall. This was a while ago, but he clarified the incident, and he also said, although no one had gotten hurt, very publicly so. Do you think that instances like this will perhaps restore confidence if they come from both sides when escalation happens? And acknowledgement, he also acknowledged that it shouldn't have happened. Do you think that these small steps will perhaps build confidence for both of them?
I think so. It does show that the US is very keen to get out of this war as quick as possible, both with the midterms on its way, the oil companies suggesting that reserve infrastructure is likely to come under significant private pressure in about 4 weeks' time, and major agricultural problems likely to kick in around October. So there is this real impetus in Washington to try and get this done and not blow things out of proportion. It's very different to, where every incident became an escalation back in February. The fact that Trump is willing to say that, it does give us a sign that it is coming from the highest authorities that, frankly, the US is very keen to get out of this deal. And I do find it somewhat odd or interesting that Trump went into a conference the other day and stated, look, we're glad the Israelis have signed, or glad the Iranians have signed the MOU in Versailles, because, frankly, we were 4 weeks away from very serious economic issues. So the US, I think, knows how dire the clock is at the moment, and they're desperately trying to find some sort of a way to get out of this. And I think a drone going down or some unmanned material where there can't be a lot of political capital for it going down, that's an easy one that the US can overlook in exchange for getting the shipping lanes going again.
Fair enough. Binar, when we look at this relationship as far as US and Israel also, do you think that US has made Israel understand, and perhaps there is, or do you think it's too optimistic, that there is an acknowledgement from Israeli side that they cannot escalate beyond a certain point, or do you think that adventurism is something we cannot rule out from Netanyahu's side, considering his domestic situation also?
I think, sorry, I haven't got your question clearly. If you kindly repeat that, there's a cut in my connections here.
No problem. As far as the situation, Netanyahu's domestic situation is also flailing. I mean, we know that what's happening from inside Israel. Considering that, and also the fact that we see US very publicly saying, if we look at J.D. Vance's statement, that we want our friends to support this, and of course we know where that signal is going very clearly as far as Israel is concerned. Do you think that there is an acknowledgement from Netanyahu's side that whereas he may try to placate his domestic audience, he cannot go beyond a certain point with regard to escalation and afford to take on the US?
Yeah, I think President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance has been seriously working on this issue, and they have on several times pointed out about some of the rhetorics and some of the activities that comes out from the Middle East and the ally in Middle East, Israel. So I believe that there's a certain red line that some of the stakeholders cannot cross, especially when it comes to the negotiation between Washington and Tehran. We have to see in the upcoming days how serious this negotiation is going and what kind of result it could bring in. But I think the US administration is really keen and really serious about this negotiation. And I see that there are some red lines for all the stakeholders within this framework.
In terms of Michael, when we see, and this is a follow-up of as far as Netanyahu is concerned in his pursuit of power, when we see what's happening, it started from, of course, what we're looking at is Palestine, what's happening here. Do you think that itself, is it going to end in terms of accountability? Because the world has for a while been looking at the US. Of course, we are looking at some kind of a reaction come, and of course it's dictated by, in a sense, what's happening domestically in the US also. But is anybody going to hold Netanyahu accountable?
It's very difficult to know. Obviously, there are corruption charges hanging over his head that might come back, but Netanyahu's managed to achieve all of these recent geopolitical aims, as well as build his relationship on the fact that he has been so close to the United States. And has said that he can get the United States on side and use the US to help the Israel achieve their goals in the region. If, let's say, there is a demand for the Israelis to pull back from Lebanon, Israelis have been lost taking that ground. It's very difficult politically for him to walk that back and say, well, sorry, Trump said we had to, he's the one in command of this war. That's a very difficult position for Netanyahu to take. So it's, he wants to probably either keep this going or at least hold on to his gains in the difficult position he is. Trump wants to walk it back to try and get the Iranians to come to the table as quick as possible. Again, these are positions that neither side is going to be really willing to budge on. And whilst Israel is included in the deal, it is probably going to be pretty difficult to get any sort of final agreement here. Even though the United States and Iran would have advantages by ending this conflict.
Binar, how much is economic considerations, economic consideration going to be markets, energy markets, the way that they've reacted? What percentage, in your opinion, very roughly speaking, is going to be responsible for ensuring that this sails through? And of course, it's crunch domestically for the US and what it means for Iran in the sense that, of course, we've seen the first installment go through. But that alone, the economic consideration of it, how much is it responsible and how much of it can ensure that this actually sails through?
I think the economic side of this equation is really important. We're talking about roughly 20% of the world oil market, and with the beginning of this confrontation and these hostilities between both sides, we have seen that the Strait of Hormuz has been severely affected by this confrontation. So this will make the oil prices higher. And this is a problem for United States right now because Donald Trump is going, it's quite close that the midterm elections that is coming, and the prices of oil and gas in the United States is not quite as it used to be before. So there is this incentive that the US side wants to try to stabilize the prices of oil and gas globally as much as it's possible. But also it's very important for the Iranian people, and it's one of the key indicators of Iranian exports to their neighboring countries, but also to their allies in the other part of the world. So I think the economic sector here is really important, and it is something that can decide about the political and security configurations as well in the upcoming days during the negotiations.
Right, fair enough. Michael, I also want your opinion on this as far as the economic considerations, and also in terms of the mediatory efforts that are at play, by countries like Pakistan. We also know Qatar and other nations. Do you think that we as those nations and those intermediaries can take more steps to ensure that there are confidence building measures between both states? Do you think more can be done by those like Pakistan who are making a back-breaking effort for this to come through?
Yeah, on the economic front, it is very important that this gets going again. Not only for particularly things like fertilizer, which need to come out to get back to crops in the developing world, to stop the power rationing that we're seeing right through Asia at the moment. It is very important the strait gets going. But it's not just important that a deal gets signed, it's that the world trusts that deal. Both for insurers effectively going, look, we're willing to lower the insurance to what it was beforehand, which is not where it is at the moment, and that ships are willing to go back into the strait. We've seen periods where ships come out, and yes, that does lower the price of oil once more ships will flee out the strait as soon as possible. But whether they're willing to go back in and risk being trapped again is a whole other story. So I think that will be we might see a slight drop when it immediately comes in, probably a jump up afterwards when people are a little nervous to go back in and see how solid it is before we then start to see stabilization. And that's something Trump will desperately want before the midterm elections. As for second or third parties like Pakistan, they've been absolutely crucial. What we've known from the leaks that have come out from some of these talks is that talks have pretty quickly broken down when they've been between some of the US negotiators and the Iranian negotiators, and they can't agree on a few points. Whereas having someone like Pakistan who does understand what both sides are hoping to achieve and finding out where both sides' red lines are is really crucial, that they can kind of talk through what the other side's thinking and find a way that both sides can bring this together without either side losing face in a face-to-face meeting. So crucially, it's going to be guys like Pakistan in negotiations, Kazakhstan, who's offered to take possession of any nuclear materials, should that be part of the deal, Qatar, who has good relations with both sides. It'll take all of these guys to try and make sure that deal is going through. And I think, them and Oman will be the key players here.
Right. Binar, in terms of, regional practical confidence building measures, Michael also spoke about them. But for us to ensure, as far as military posturing is concerned, do you think both nations realize that perhaps this is not the time for military posturing and that they have to prioritize dialogue? Do you think that realization is there at this time, as far as the US and Iran both countries are concerned?
Yeah, I think the role of regional mediators can play a very, very important role, because both sides may not fully trust each other, but they may trust the process if credible third parties like Pakistan, for example, are involved. So countries like Pakistan, like the other states that has been mentioned, can help by keeping the communication open, by trying to reduce the misunderstandings and offering face-saving options. So the most useful role for mediators is not just to pause the talks, but also to create a disciplined process. That means a regular communication, rapid crisis management, and clear reporting when either side believe the agreement has been violated. And also the mediators should also focus on practical issues. For example, we talked about the maritime security, the protection of civilian shipping, for example, and keeping the diplomatic teams engaged. So big political issues like the sanctions, for example, the nuclear file, which will take time. And this is a larger issue that needs a bigger framework and a bigger time. But preventing escalation at this point is what keeps this larger negotiation alive for tomorrow. So I think it's really, really important that both sides have this understanding that military posturing is not an option at this stage, but the open dialogue through these communications channels is the only chance that we can stabilize the region.
Michael, do you think purely in terms of economics again, as far as US and Iran are concerned, where they are with regard to the Strait of Hormuz, where they are with regard to the first installment having gone, can both countries afford to go back, when you look at where we are geopolitically?
I think it's very difficult for the US. They're probably not going to get a position that it was as good as what it was prior to February. And that's going to be a difficult pill to swallow before the midterms. For the Iranians, obviously I think they'd like to go back to something, what it was with February, maybe even with tolls or fees going through the Strait of Hormuz. But the Iranians are also aware that this is probably the best shot they're ever going to have on getting a really good deal that sets them up for the next kind of decade or so. They have the midterms coming up. They have oil coming to a really dire point, and because the US attacked almost unilaterally, and there's not a lot of other outside support for what the US actions are here, the Iranians are in a pretty strong diplomatic position, saying, "Look, we didn't cause this. We need help to kind of solve this problem." This is a once in a lifetime opportunity for them, and I think they're going to try and make it as hard as they possibly can for the United States to prevent another strike like this in the future. After all, there was no real retaliation from the Iranians after the killing of Soleimani or after the strikes on Fordow or after the Israelis targeted nuclear scientists. And, if this was to, let's say, go back to normal, there is a concern in Tehran that pattern may just continue, and the US or the Israel might just come back into play in 6 or 8 months' time after the midterm elections. So I think the Iranians have to put a hard enough position in place to deter the US from going back down that road.
Before I go to Binar, a quick question. Michael, in terms of, and I will go to him, Binar, on this also, but in terms of leverage, it is being said earlier on that Iran has perhaps enjoyed greater leverage with regard to these negotiations. But do you think there's also danger of sort of taking it too far? Like you said, sort of building up on this. I mean, they must sort of realize that they have to step back. Do you think that realization is there?
Obviously, if Iran takes this too far and the world starts to see this as Iran causing the problems, then yes, Iran will probably have to step back. But at the same time, if they don't take it far enough, they risk the US coming back too quickly. It is obviously finding that middle spot, and I guess the Iranians at this point are thinking that they will get a better deal the longer they hold out. And there's a phrase that used to be very common in Afghanistan, but it is popping up now, which is, the US has the watches, but Iran has the time here. So I think the Iranians are in a probably better position than they have been for a while. Can they do this forever? No, this is very much hurting the Iranian economy. But I think the Iranian population has a much higher pain tolerance than the Trump administration, who is going into a midterm election, or some of these European states that are drawing their reserves down quite quickly, or some of the US's Asian partners who are now rationing out power because of US actions, and that's very much hurting US credibility across the globe. So, Iran can't go too far, but I think they know they can probably go further than what they are now.
Binar, do you agree? Because, earlier on I remember talking to somebody on this very program, and they said, well, it seems Iran has both the watches at the time. Do you think that that's a correct assessment of the situation? Of course, we know that they are a resilient nation, and they have stood with having a lot of economic difficulties, even through this conflict also. But how do you look at the situation?
Yeah, I think there is this argument that Iran has certainly tried to use the current tensions and confrontations as a leverage, but simply I would not describe it as it is, simply as Iran seeking a wider war or wider confrontation, because Tehran's approach has often been to show that the pressure that is on Iran is also on the region or on the wider region, especially around the Gulf security, especially around the maritime roads, and especially around the US regional interest. But this is risky form of leverage. It may give Iran bargaining power in a short term, but it can also increase mistrust between them, or invite further retaliation and make the diplomacy more difficult. So the key point is this, that leverage maybe can help bringing the parties to the table. But if it turns into uncontrolled escalation, can destroy the diplomatic opening that both sides have been working so hard to have it in the past time.
Right. Thank you so much for being with us. On that note, thank you for joining us. Binar F.K, thank you for being with us. Michael Hilliard, thank you for joining us today. Of course, at this time, we may talk about the leverage one country has over the other. As far as US or Iran is concerned, we may talk about negotiations, we may talk about who has the time and who has the watches. But in fact, this is a conflict that has a very real cost. This is a conflict that has a human cost. This is a conflict that has a real economic cost that seems to be resonating around the world even as we speak. Of course, one hopes that there will be a resolution, and of course, at the back, there is back-breaking effort of diplomacy that, of course, countries like Pakistan have made, which, of course, have entailed sacrifices, which, of course, have entailed a lot of effort. One hopes that this MOU will morph into a full-blown agreement very soon, and that the 60-day period will be sufficient. Thank you so much for joining us today on Perspective.